Hi, folks. Mr. McGlashan here. Today is the U.S. in World War I, aka my attempt to convince you to join the United States military. Or not. We'll see. But I always start with that question, actually. Are you going to join up? Yeah, so when we're in class together, I'll be presenting you, or I'll be asking you for your response to this question, because I think it just says so much about our culture to listen to what young people your age think about the military. What are the chances? So this is what I'm going to ask. What are the chances that you are going to join one of the branches of the United States military? Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, Coast Guard, and I don't think have they made their emblem? They probably have. Space Force is in effect. So those are the branches. What are the chances? Would you give it 50-50? 100% chance that you're going to go sign up when you turn 18? Which branch? What are some of your thoughts on why it would be a good idea or a bad idea to join the United States military? Do you feel that it's your duty to do that? Do you feel any sense that that's something that you should do for your country, or is that not something that you believe? So go ahead and think about that, and then when we're in class together, we'll talk about it, maybe in some breakout rooms. What would your parents say if you ran off on your 18th birthday without telling them, because you don't have to tell them at that point, and joined? Would they look at you, and what would they think? Would they be proud? Would they be scared, ashamed? What our culture says, or what our young people, how they view the military, says a lot about our culture, and it's fascinating. So I look forward to that discussion. Is it this? When you think of the U.S. military, yeah, sexy, tough, awesome, fun, adventure. Oh, God. There's some art from an artist that served in World War I. Oh, yeah. No, come on. This is war, right? I mean, some people have visions of war that are maybe not like this, but this glorified sense that war is going to be awesome. Yeah, that's real. Oh, okay, let's be real. This is war. Let's be real. Let's look at this accurately. All right, this is what it's like. So everybody, okay, maybe don't join. Okay, I'm joking. I shouldn't joke. It's terrible. So obviously we know that there has been a glorification of war in our culture, but realistically, this is a Syrian refugee kid fleeing the war in Syria. That's also in Syria. Or should we look at it this way? Come on, people. So again, our views of war. How is war presented in our culture? How is the military presented? And how do young people grow up? And what sense do they have for what it will be? I'm showing you some gruesome images. But guys, World War I is kind of the ultimate in gruesome. So let's start there. Okay, to understand World War I, you got to understand what a million looks like, because then you've got a picture. A million young people running straight at machine guns for 4.5 years straight. Not a million, 12 million. Let's look at this. This here is what 1,000 people looks like. Just to be clear about what we're talking about with World War I, the utter lunacy of the death count. That is 500,000. If each one of those little squares was this. Okay, that's actually how many we've lost today to COVID. So I found this graphic in the paper. I have various ways I've tried to show the magnitude of what 12 million dead young people looks like. Because here's 500,000, each of those little boxes, again, being 1,000. And this is what you got to look at for World War I. So, folks, there's no question that this is a war that made people rethink war itself. It was a war that made people think that it would be the war to end all wars. That's what Woodrow Wilson said after this war. The art that came out of World War I is still with us today. Soldiers that were just damaged, but were able to express the horror of what they went through in that war through art and movies. All of these that I'm showing you here at the end are artists from World War I. So you see what haunted their dreams. All right, folks. So hopefully you studied this in world history, but why was Europe like a powder keg and ready to explode in 1914? Let's talk about causes of war. What caused World War I? Most people learn Maine, right? Maine. What's Maine? It's the reason why Europe was ready to explode. They said the Balkans were the powder keg of Europe. I'd say Europe overall was like a powder keg, meaning one match, Maine. Militarism. alliances, imperialism and nationalism. That's what most teachers use, and it's a good formula, okay? But let's look at those, okay? Imperialism. What we're talking about with World War I, why we had the most devastating war up until that moment, was that every country in the 200 years before World War I that had power used it to conquer and take and dominate. This was the age of imperialism. So what Vladimir Lenin said was that you have capitalism that necessarily leads to imperialism, and then imperialism leads to world war. And that was his explanation for what caused World War I. Okay, yeah, every country in the world just trying to take. And of course, Europe did the easy taking already, and they went and took areas that were less developed. But you know, Europe itself was a continent of empires. This is the map of Europe before World War I. Note, you don't see Poland, you don't see Czech Republic or Slovakia or Slovenia, or I mean, so many dozens of countries in here that we've made since the Baltic countries, and we've got, you know, Ukraine, and so this is an age of empires. Okay, so World War I very much comes out of that, and I'd say it was the beginning of the unwinding of empires because it taught us something. Because when everybody does use their power as much as possible to take, it leaves everyone cascading towards war. All right, so let's keep going. Got a lot to say today, folks. I'm going to move fast. Feel free to pause anytime. Nationalism. All right, when did wearing a suit like that go out of style? When did that go out of style? Come on, it's a nice suit. Well, let's just say, when were you go from being a doofus for wearing that to becoming a terrorist? Like, when did that? I joke. Nationalism, folks. This is this extreme love of country that almost always usually turns into a form of chauvinism. When we look at the countries of World War I, or the countries of Europe in the lead up to World War I, they had fanatical devotions to their country. So if I'd asked that question that I asked you at the beginning about whether you'll join to a group of 17-year-old Germans in 1908, will you join? And the answer was, duh, like, don't even ask. Like, unless there's something wrong with you. This is just an absolute dedication to country. And then the terrible prejudices that were taught in schools to people, the hatreds, the stereotypes that that each country in Europe and around the world had of other races and other countries. All right, so and along with that, of course, is this propaganda that we'll talk about. But nationalism was stirred up. Here's a British poster, the lion representing Great Britain, and just this idea of the pride that you got to stand up for your country. And this is a German one where the German guy is slaying the British lion. So yes, we have this stirring up of extreme love of country. Are we nationalistic today in America? What is the state of American nationalism? I think it's fascinating because it's changed just during the Trump presidency. It's different now than it was 2-3 years ago. What does that mean to be patriotic and nationalistic and to show the sort of outward signs of patriotism? Militarism, folks. This is another cause. So we're looking at, why did Europe cascade in the war over a single assassination? All right, we all know that the immediate match that lit World War I was the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. But why? Why did an entire continent and then an entire world need to come into the worst war in the history of the world just because of one political assassination? All right, and the reason why is these. Militarism, okay? We had countries across Europe fanatically devoted to their militaries, building up massive armies, glorifying war itself, teaching through propaganda and in our schools and in our history books the greatness of war, the adventure of war, the duty of war. And then we face the industrial age. And so whatever, countries have been fighting wars for generations, forever, since the dawn of humanity, but you give them machines of war, machine guns and tanks. And so all the new weapons that were available made World War I, of course, just that much more terrible. Arms races. The big arms race that led up to World War I was the British Navy versus the German Navy. Actually, I have that here. So you have the Britain with a certain number of dreadnoughts. I think this was from 1905. You can look at the source, but they had 22 dreadnoughts, so the Germans were behind. And so they were on a crash course to build these new terrible warships. Yeah, so if you look at it, total numbers of standing armies, these were the biggest armies in the history of the world. I mean, they may have been, I forget, there was some, I don't think so. 12 million strong are soldiers going to combat from Russia. 500,000. They were bigger than in World War II because the individual soldier was not quite as important in World War II because it was all about tanks and planes. Unbelievable standing armies. This is before the war started. France has 4 million of its citizens in uniform. The total size of the United States military today, with Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, is 1.4 million, 1.2 million, depending on how you count it. Okay, 4 million standing armies with populations, 1/6 of the size of our population. So yes, across the board. United States, not so much. When we look at these causes of war, the United States had a nationalistic culture for sure. The United States did not have a super militaristic culture. The Civil War was kind of a precursor that sort of left a few generations in the United States a little less prone to war than our European allies. So we had this historic isolationism, at least with respect to European affairs. You all know that the idea that the United States was ever really isolationist is somewhat of a joke. But yes, at the time, we still had a strong strain of resistance to entering this European war. And yeah, we're not building massive armies. They say our army was the 19th most prepared in the world in 1914. Not high on the list. All right, expenditures. America caught up. You can see that in the very last lead up to the war by 1913, we didn't quite catch up, but the United States starts getting close. Okay, moving on. Militarism. Folks, this is just important for us to reflect on today. Is the United States militaristic? Well, with respect to the dollars that we put towards military, no question. So here we are in 2018, the United States far outspending any other country in the world. Okay, and if you look at most of these are allies, though China's military spending is always understated. It's always understated. It's realistically well over 250 billion at this point. But so much of it is civilian military combined, and so they tend to measure it differently. But nevertheless, the United States is just an extreme military spender at this point. There's no question about it. All right, and we'll get back to that later on. Folks, propaganda is what I got to add to main, because that sort of government information promoting a way of thinking, promoting the militarism, promoting the imperialism, promoting the extreme vicious nationalism, that was such a critical component. And we have what they called memes back in 1914. What do we call them today? I don't know, but they were memes. That was the term they used. I'm kidding, but they were. Look at it. I mean, this was the age of the placard. This is the age of the image. Newspapers were king. Okay, the radio age is in the 1920s, just after, and the television age is until the 1950s. So this was the age when the visual image on a page was king. So yes, the propaganda. Together we win. The glorification of war. Daddy, what did you do in the Great War? Are you going to face yourself 10 years later and have to tell your children that you did not serve? Okay, that's the culture that was being created, and not just in Britain and eventually the United States. You see, we took to it as well during the war. We took to propaganda in a huge way. But Russian, German, French, Balkan, Serbian, I mean, everyone was being inundated by their governments and by their culture with this vision of war, that it was glorious. I mean, it's notable that the Europeans hadn't really had any major domestic wars in a few generations. They had been fighting the easy wars overseas, fighting against countries that didn't have machine guns. War was fun when you just got to go shoot at people with machine guns when they had spears. Okay, no, but I mean, again, we had, a false sense that war meant victory had sunk into the culture. Women of Britain say go. Yes, this idea that you are not a man if you don't go sign up. This is one of my favorite of the U.S. Army's recruitment posters. The mad brute, that little helmet is, of course, a reference to the German military. The presentations of the German and the American media during the war. They didn't start this way. When we started the war, we were trying to stay out of it, and our government was trying to get people to want to stay out of it. But once we got in, the War Industries Board kicked in, or the War Information Board. Sorry, we'll get to that. But yes, the U.S. created a whole division of the government to issue propaganda. Yes, learn to make and test the big guns. All right. Folks, there is so much incredible propaganda, both old and new, that I would love to spend days looking at with you. But what I'm going to do is just present two right now. When we think about the state of militarism and nationalism in our world, oh, heck yeah. I'm so in. All right. That's my militarism, nationalism, cultural dipstick. How did you feel while you watched that? If you got a little pumped, then you're a little nationalistic and then maybe a little militaristic. But if you felt nothing, then you are severely lacking in nationalism. But the test goes on, because I'm going to play another one here. That's the real test, because often part of nationalism is a little bit of cultural prejudice towards another country and a little competition in there. So let's look at a Chinese military recruitment film here.
我是谁？
走了吗？
我是母亲倚在门口牵不到的那只手。
车站北大服装已经在了。
我是妻子舍不得挂掉的电话。
哎，你再讲会儿嘛。喂，老公，你什么时候回来啊？
我是儿子眼里不敢靠近的陌生人。我是亲人的牵挂与骄傲。
我宣誓，听党指挥，听党指挥。
我身后是和平，我面前是战争。拿起钢枪，就要放下儿女情长；穿上军装，就要舍弃舒适安逸。征战疆场，男儿本色；从军报国，此生无悔。 中国军人，我是人民子弟兵，我是美好生活的守护者。
You see that? When did they get better at propaganda than us? When did that happen? Jeez, that was well done. I mean, you know what? I'm in. So anyway, watching those two videos should make you get some sense for what we're talking about here, which is that in Europe, in the lead up to the First World War, we had this type of nationalism. Propaganda, not as good as that, thank goodness, but the propaganda was primarily placards and things like this. But it was the age of the movies, so America came to see World War I in the movie theater, and it was presented to them at first as pretty awesome and adventurous and exciting, and especially in recruitment propaganda. So anyway, where are we going with this? All right, we're just looking at the causes of World War I. So I just wanted you to get that understanding of how it relates to sort of where we're dealing with today. Do we have the type of nationalism and imperialism, militarism that we had common around the world in 1914? And scarily, you're going to find that it is indeed still around. And, you know, the big picture of the World War I lesson in general, the big picture of this whole story is how to avoid these things. We know what caused the most terrible war in human history to that point. 12 million men to be thrown into trenches to die by machine gun. And, you know, that's why we talk about Maine and militarism, imperialism, because we saw it happen. And then we saw those same things cause World War II. And so hopefully humanity has learned a lesson, you know, that we need to temper this type of nationalism and militarism. All right, folks, but other lessons related to the causes of World War I. Okay, the fact that the world was characterized by secret alliances, that there was very little international law and order, very little. We had a couple rudimentary treaties that had been built since the 1800s. Nations had come together to try to coordinate post offices and to, you know, create some international order. Of course, we had the Geneva Conventions after World War I, and then we had the League of Nations, and we had United Nations. What we're talking about is we had none of that stuff leading up to World War I. And so you have a world where the only way for countries to have any influence, power, ability to send their ships from here to there around the world was to get that power through conquest and war. International law was defined by who had won past wars. War was rewarded. The more wars you won, the better trade deals you got. So everything in the international order promoted war. And war was a means to success. When you don't have fair international institutions, it's treaties that define international law, and treaties come at the end of wars. So, yes, we have a complex network of secret treaties in Europe that I'm sure you've studied before in world history, but we have the Triple Entente, which involved a loose alliance between Britain, France, and Russia, mostly allied based on the paranoia of a rising Germany. Okay, Germany, feeling surrounded by hostile powers, made an alliance with an aging but massive empire, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. So we had other little alliances. For example, Serbia was somewhat ethnically and just allied with Russia. Russia has an ethnic connection to Serbians and has a long history of influence there. And so, so you have that being an alliance. The United States had no alliances at all going into this war. It was a great advantage of ours that we were committed to defend none. But you know the story. It starts in this little city, Sarajevo. We're talking about causes of war. This is now the match. Okay, we had the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, a beautiful man named Archduke Franz Ferdinand. He was next in line to become king of Austria-Hungary. And he was visiting Sarajevo, a city that had only recently become part of Austria-Hungary, and that many Serbians and other ethnic minorities, such as the Bosnians, believed that it was not an Austro-Hungarian city. It's to this day, Sarajevo is a very ethnically diverse city. And so you had a king, or future king, visiting a city that he ruled, but it was a shaky rule and had met plenty of locals that were opposed to this rule. So this is, a classic example of imperialism causing war. Okay, so Okay, so Franz Ferdinand is visiting the city, and it's a goodwill mission. He is inspecting the Austro-Hungarian troop formations that were down there at the time. Serbia is an enemy of Austria-Hungary and had been actively fighting border wars. So a very tense situation, but he goes down on a goodwill mission, and he's traveling in an open vehicle, and you know the story. A group of terrorists jumps out and kill him. So that you understand the gravity of what happened that day, I'm going to zoom in on that mustache was killed. He's dead. What happens to a mustache on a dead person? And the guy with this weird punky mustache is the one who did it. Gavrilo Princip was the one of the members of a group called the Black Hand. And these were Serbian nationalists that hated Austria-Hungary because they felt threatened by Austro-Hungarian imperialism, and they were part of a secret terrorist organization to assassinate the king of Austria-Hungary. And it was a great day, a lucky moment for him. Now, what's the story? Yeah, that the king was driving through town. One guy came out and threw a pipe bomb, and the king, or future king, knocked the pipe bomb away. There he is in his fancy car, driving through town in a convertible. Bad idea. And he knocks the pipe bomb away, though, and the pipe bomb falls to the ground and explodes and injures some passerbys. And all of the sirens ring, and he's in a motorcade, you know, of course, with police and everything. And they go screaming through the city, and they get him to safety. He gets to the governor's mansion, or mayor's mansion or something, and he's safe. And they tell him, right, don't go outside. The streets are crazy. There's people out there who want to kill you. And so, but he insists. He says he wants to go visit the hospital where some of the people who had been injured by the pipe bomb were. Because again, he's down there on a goodwill mission. So he's trying to, you know, make the people of the city love him and et cetera. So he insists, gets back into his car. And then they get into a weird traffic circle where he has to stop for a second. Now, the 5 members of the Black Hand had lined up at various spots around the parade path to assassinate him. And the one that threw the pipe bomb was the one that got closest. Doesn't work. The rest of the members are bumped. They're like, oh, game over. And they all start walking home. Gavrilo Princip was literally with a gun in his pocket walking home saying, oh, this was a failure. And suddenly he sees that the king had come back out into his same convertible car, back into the streets, walks up, kills him. Why did I focus so long on that story? Because it's a great story. But here's the deal, folks. Austria-Hungary insists that it gets to send its military in to investigate who killed their future king and into Serbia because they figured that the people had come from Serbia. Serbia says, heck no, you guys can't come barging into our country. We'll investigate. Austria-Hungary decides to declare war on Serbia. And that fateful decision sent a cascading effect across the continent that eventually brings, 60, 90 countries in the world into this war. It didn't have to happen. Let's be clear. This war was not caused by the assassination, okay? This political assassination could have been dealt with by the great powers. There was a decision made to make war, and that decision was made primarily in the capital of Germany. Let's be clear. Germany had at that point been just flexing its muscles. It was a country that had never really established itself as a world power, and yet it had the second largest industrial economy in the world. It had the largest army and most well-equipped army in the world. Its generals were confident and ready. And in fact, basically what happened is Germany told Austria-Hungary, we got your back, like go in there. Because Austria-Hungary understood that if they declare war on Serbia, Serbia has a backer. Russia. Anyone could have done the math. The second Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated. Everyone in European capitals went, uh-oh. But it didn't have to happen. Cooler heads could have prevailed, but no! Austria-Hungary's allies agree to back them up. So when Russia declares war, they declare war there, and then they declare war, and then they declare war, and I'm pretty sure everybody's at war now. Eventually, Italy backed out of it. But yeah, so that's why one assassination can quickly lead to a great world war, and that's what happened. But really, realistically, what happened is that people did the math, and Germany invaded France. So that's where the war actually began. So this was just all like international diplomatic calculus, declarations of war, but the country that was poised and confident and ready to achieve greatness. All right, so the war's on, all right? And this is, of course, European history. Let's get to America, all right? Because this is the United States in the war. basically the way Americans viewed this war is this. This is the way they viewed it, which was just a tangled web of alliances and no reason for us to be involved. It was just politically, nobody in the United States wanted to go to war. Okay, so Wilson declares neutrality. In 1914, we are out. We are not involved. Okay, Washington's old warning just rang very true, to be wary of them entangling alliances with European affairs. Okay. We had, leading up to this war, already begun a whole thing about free trade and freedom of the seas, and so we just continued to say that, and we maintained a neutrality between both sides. We were willing to sell both sides weapons. So let's be clear, it was on. The war was the best thing ever for the United States economy. Our economy just exploded during the war, making not only weapons, but also food and supplies and uniforms and everything for originally both sides, but circumstances meant that we ended up selling most of our stuff to Britain and France, the Allies. So, and that's part of what drew us into the war on their side. So American factories were on. It affected our economy hugely. Okay, so we began a lot of sort of government oversight of the economy. During all wars, the role of the government in the economy expands. And so we started the War Industries Board in 1918. Once we were deeply in the war, we even had a lot of coordination between the government and our labor unions. So it was very important that when we're fighting a war, that we can't have people striking. And so there was a great effort made by the president, Woodrow Wilson, to work with the labor unions to negotiate essentially national deals where all the workers of the country would get 10% raises if they'd agree not to strike. And most labor unions were part of the AFL at that time, and they tended to go along. Samuel Gompers, their head, went to Washington and met with Wilson and agreed that they would not strike. Whereas some of the more radical labor unions, like the Wobblies, led by Debs, I believe, at this time, they refused. But most of them held in line during the war, and then not a lot of strikes happened, even though profits were exploding. So the temptation for unions to want to unionize and strike and demand a little bit of this unbelievably quickly growing economy, it was certainly there. All right, so the Atlantic trade. You look at our exports, okay? When the war started, we were exporting the most to Britain and then Germany, but look what happens to exports to Germany. The war starts in 1914. We enter in 1917, spoiler alert. But for several years in there, the United States stayed out of this war and just became the factory of the war. So why did this happen? Well, Britain successfully blockaded Germany in this war. And it's perhaps the most important story of the war as far as who won it. But Britain blockaded Germany essentially. And so Germany just didn't have access with surface ships to the Atlantic. The one thing Germany did have, though, that could go under the British blockade, their submarines, but you can't transport goods on submarines. So massive increase in exports to Britain, massive increase to France, decline to Germany. And you can see it visually here. Okay, so Germany, it just sort of drops off. So we were willing to trade with both sides at the beginning of the war, but strategically we then got in with the Allies, Britain and France. Okay, let's be clear. We're talking about what drew the United States into the war. That's kind of the big question. What were the causes of the United States moving to war? And from an AP perspective, you're more likely to get questions about causes of wars than about the war itself. Okay, there's not going to be a question about Franz Ferdinand. I'm sorry. I don't know why I told you that story, but anyway, we are going to look at causes though. So like, to what extent did American attitudes towards the war change from 1914 to 1917 or to 1919? Okay, that could be a question you might see. And okay, one of the things that brought America into war was the military-industrial complex. And that's the way Eisenhower later described it. But, there's Britain's blockade, the reason why Germany couldn't access the oceans. All right, so the military-industrial complex. The idea behind that is that we developed a vested interest in the British and French war effort. We had, first of all, given them weapons, but also loaned them huge amounts of money to buy those weapons. So American banks basically financed the British and the French war effort, and not completely, but largely. So as Britain and France run short on cash, the one country that was running a stable economic system and a stable currency was the United States. In fact, our Federal Reserve Bank, which at that point was brand new, was the best thing in town as far as money creation. During the war, European powers, various currencies went up and down and were unstable, or they were just choked off. They were on a gold standard, where they just weren't issuing very much currency. And as you know, the more currency you are willing to create as a nation, the more credit is available, the more loans you have to give. So the United States becomes the great loaner in chief during this war. Guys, America goes from being a third-rate world economy and country. Okay, that's exaggerated, but the extent to which our economy grew to become a global powerhouse during the war is large. Okay, and so yeah, our Federal Reserve Bank, which sort of coordinated our system for money creation, allowed the United States and Wall Street to loan large amounts of money to Britain and France. And when you loan a country money, you want to get paid back. So the more we loan to Britain and France, the more interested we are in their survival and their success. So we develop over the course of the war a vested interest in the war effort of the Allies. Okay, folks, defense spending. I like to make modern connections. You see here we've got World War I, and this is World War II, and then this is just everything since. Okay, you can even go further back. This is the Civil War here, and this is World War I, World War II. So we became a global weapons manufacturer during this war. And so even when we weren't using our own money to buy our own weapons, we began exporting weapons all over the world. Here's the quote from Eisenhower about what he later calls the military-industrial complex. You could argue that it started during World War I. All right, I gotta move on. Okay. Causes of the United States entering the war is, of course, largely German U-boats, okay? The Germans made the best U-boat during this war, and they were extremely effective at disappearing under the British warships. So in the first few naval battles of the war, Britain achieved surface dominance, and they were able to blockade Germany in, but Germany then just turned to its submarines, and it became just sort of a weapon of terror. Britain could sail its ships across the Atlantic as much as it wants, transporting goods, but every 10th ship is going to get sunk when a submarine pops up out of nowhere and sinks it. Yeah, that's the basic calculus. All right, so the United States is a non-combatant. We're not in this war. We're declaring neutrality, freedom of the seas, free trade. Well, Germany's saying, no, you are directly supplying our enemy with buckets and buckets of weapons daily. In fact, we would have won this war if it wasn't for your constant supply of weapons to our enemy. And the United States tried to hide behind that, but we'd sell them to you if you could get your ships over here to pick them up, but we can't. And so America's insisting that we're non-combatant, we're neutral. Germany is more and more realizing that we are the engine of their enemy's war effort. Okay, and so they start sinking ships that have American cargo on them, and they start sinking ships that have Americans on them, and America then sends threats back to Germany, and we have this whole period in there where we're trying to stay out of the war. We're telling Germany, quit dragging us in this war. We're not in it. And Germany's saying, well, quit loading weapons to our enemies. And as long as these are ships full of weapons, we have to defend ourselves. But Germany doesn't want us in the war either. And so they're saying, we're sorry. Okay, all this comes to a head with the sinking of the Lusitania. Okay, that's the most prominent one. Okay, and it was in 1915, so we didn't join the war a year and a half later. But in 1915, it was a British-owned passenger ship, but it's going, I believe, from New York to London, and it held a whole bunch of Americans on board. It was a luxury passenger line, a lot like the Titanic when you look at it. And it was supposed to be just a civilian ship, and it was traveling across the ocean, and a German U-boat pops up and just pokes a hole right in the side. It was just off the coast of Ireland here, headed to Britain, and sinks it. And it looks like the Titanic. This is not the Titanic. It's known as the Lusitania. And like the Titanic, some half of the people on it died. New York Times, Lusitania sunk by submarine, probably 1,200 dead, twice torpedoed. So everyone knew Germany did it. So America starts to get, so this commitment to staying out of the war starts to turn to a lot of anger towards Germany. Okay. And our Hollywood, our propaganda and movies start to turn around here. And you start to see sort of pop mass culture start to turn on Germany, and the depictions of Germany in the media become evil and sinister. And so this was a very important moment. But we stayed out. Germany said, I'm sorry, we're sorry, we won't do it anymore, because they didn't want us in the war. And so we make a deal with them. It was actually after another one was sunk called the Sussex, which is just another ship of that had American equipment on board, and Americans on board, and the Germans sunk it. And after that, the Germans gave us the Sussex Pledge that we will no longer sink any ships except warships, and from armies and navies that are fighting a war against us. So if it's got an American flag, we'll leave it alone. If it's just a commercial ship, we'll leave it alone. We don't want to bring America to the war. Deal. They broke it just immediately. They never stopped, okay? And then at some point in 1917, they start ratcheting up their attacks, despite their pledges, okay? These are the sites of known torpedo attacks, okay, or ships sunk by U-boats. Most of them were British, but a lot of them had American supplies, at least, and American bankers lost money, and occasionally American ships. All right, so that was just brazenly, okay? But we still didn't go to war. I mean, after the Sussex Pledge in 1916, they sunk many more ships that had American cargo on it. But our president was, of course, dead set on doing what he promised he'd do and keep us out of the war, okay? So let's note that, Wilson, in the midst of this, the war is raging in Europe, Wilson is promising in an election that he has to run against Hughes in 1916. And he says his famous slogan in the campaign was, he kept us out of the war. He kept us out of the war. Yeah. And so a year later, he's asking for a declaration of war. So the tension had been building and building and building, but there was still hope as late as 1917 that we could stay out of this war. Okay. Another event happened that is tangentially related to why we got in, but it is important, and it's a hugely important world event, and that is the Russian Revolution. In the midst of World War I, the Russians turned on their own monarchy, and they had had a monarchy for many, many hundreds of years. This is Tsar Nicholas II, who was the last king in the great Russian feudal monarchy. Russia was still feudal up into 1914, 15, 16. Russia suffered more than any other country in this war, as they did in World War II. Okay, the Russian army was huge, but not as well equipped. And so it just took devastating losses as Germany attacked both sides. Germany attacked in France and Russia. And so the Russian people were starving, there was food shortages, and they still had this system of nobility and feudalism and serfdom, and come on. So the people, in a couple waves of revolutions, overthrew the king and his whole government. And it was, in fact, the communist Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Ilyich Lenin, that led the Russian people to a great communist revolution. Okay, it was actually not the first one. There was one revolution, and then the communists took over after. The first government didn't kill the king, but put him on house arrest. But then the Bolsheviks lined up the entire adorable family in the basement of their home and machine gunned them to death. Yes, you got machine gunned. You got machine gunned. I know. That's cruel. They say Anastasia survived. She didn't survive. There's always these rumors that, wonder which one was Anastasia. Beautiful daughters, but machine gunned them all. The hands of a great communist revolution that changes the world. Because bottom line is, one of the things that the revolutionaries in Russia promised was peace. Part of why their movement was so popular is that they had promised that they'd get this country out of this war. The Russian people felt like their king had gotten them into a war because of a petty grievance with the king of Germany, Kaiser Wilhelm. They, in fact, went to summer camp together as kids. Tsar Nicholas II, I say summer camp, but it was like they did something together as kids. So they knew each other, personal grudge. All right. So with the king, or the Tsar of Russia, killed, the new Bolshevik government goes to Germany and says, we'd love to make a deal. And so they give up huge amounts of territory to the Germans and to the Austro-Hungarians in order to get out of the war. Okay, now why does that matter for the United States? Well, just quickly understand that going into this war, there were monarchs and democracies on both sides. You see this? We got democracy, democracy. Italy was building kind of a democracy at this point, so I give it a little D. Germany was Kaiser Wilhelm. Austria-Hungary had a king. Russia had a king, but Russia was on our side. So for the United States, just this big believer in democracy, when the war started, it seemed like squabbling kings and sultans. We had, all these countries around joined. And so it made no sense. Why would we join a war of just squabbling kings and petty grievances, etc.? But when the war progresses, first of all, what happened here? Italy joins the Allies and becomes a democracy. Turkey is a monarchy led by a sultan, and it joins Germany. And then without Russia in the war, we suddenly have king. Yeah, my thing got messed up here. Oh well. King lined up against democracy. And that happened in 1917. So for someone like Woodrow Wilson, who talked a big talk about, democracy, this, and the future of the world of democracies, that was always kind of a thing he pushed. This war sort of coalesces on essentially the only remaining democracies in the world, Britain and France and Italy, and fighting against these countries led by kings. So it really did start to feel and it legitimately became a war of democracy versus monarchy. It did. That's one thing about World War I, is it had Germany overrun Britain and France, the future of democracy in the world was threatened. It really was. Okay, so that's another thing that starts drawing America closer. But look, the tension is rising. The final straw that brings the United States into World War I was when Germany sends a secret letter to, wait for it, Mexico, trying to get Mexico to invade the United States. Okay, so this is a dastardly move, okay? It was a secret telegram sent to the German ambassador to Mexico, whose name was Zimmerman, and it was encoded. And so that's all it was. Sent, I love, on Western Union, classic. So the American sort of corporate, information network was in effect, but you send it secret code. How can anyone know? Well, the English had cracked the Germans' secret code because of guys like this, who literally would go down to fallen German submarines at the bottom of the ocean and early versions of scuba gear and get in and get the secret boxes out that would have the code cracking machines that the Germans used. So because of the heroism of British divers, they could translate this letter that Germany had sent. And yes, Germany is unashamedly, well, they at least try to keep it secret, but sorry, lost you there for a sec. Okay, so Germany's trying to get Mexico to invade the United States, promising Mexico that it would get the territories back. I love this. This is a smart move on Germany's part. They say that if you help us fight the United States, which would, they thought, keep us out of being able to fight in Europe. So it's a good move on Germany's part. Okay, they thought that eventually the United States was going to come into this war, so why not try to get a close neighbor of ours to attack, and in exchange, they would give Mexico, Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona back. Mexico was in no position to fight a war. They were in the midst of their own Mexican Revolution. So the Great Revolution with Zapata and Pancho Villa, and where the Mexican people overthrew their own dictator, was in the midst right now. So they were already, 1 million Mexicans died from 1910 to 1920 in war. Okay, so in 1917, in the midst of that, there was no way Mexico was going to start a war against the United States. So it was a miscalculation on the part of Germany. And in the letter, they straight up say that they're going to start doing unrestricted submarine warfare. So they announced their strategy, that they're just realizing that the only way they can win this war in Europe is by cutting off the supply of American arms. So there you go. Basically, the next day, Wilson comes before Congress and asks Congress for a declaration of war. So the man who just a year earlier had said, he kept us out of the war. The thing is that when this war started in 1914, polls showed that some 90% of Americans had no interest in the war. But when Wilson asked for a declaration of war, it was unbelievably popular and got a unanimous declaration from the House of Representatives and got in the Senate to fight the war. Maybe one. Was that World War II? I'm not sure. Okay, guys, the next thing we're going to do is to get a sense for this war, because now that America is proud to go fight in the trenches of Europe, we got to back up a little bit and understand why we call this the war to end all wars.
It began in June of 1914 with the assassination of the Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary. He was shot by a Serbian nationalist in Sarajevo. Ferdinand had governed in a circle of European royalty that also included the King of England, the Tsar of Russia, and the Kaiser of Germany. And together, their colonial empires dominated most of the Earth's population. And when the competitive Kaiser seized upon the assassination as a pretext to begin a European war, he found the other royals only too willing to go along. All of them sought to widen their influence. None could possibly realize how radically they were about to alter the course of the 20th century. In the summer of 1914, the generation that would fight the First World War was enthusiastic about doing so. Those young men who were so quick to answer their nation's call to arms had no reason to anticipate the hell ahead. In the German city of Koblenz, 12-year-old Joachim von Elbe began a diary.
August 5, 1914. The city is full of soldiers. They were singing this song, on, to fight we are born, on, to fight for the fatherland. To Kaiser Wilhelm we have sworn, to Kaiser Wilhelm we give our hand.
The optimism of the Germans was matched by their allies in Austria and by their enemies in Russia, in France, and in England.
As soon as I enlisted, I was in a crowd of other 18, 19, and 20-year-olds, and we thought it was going to be a tremendous lark to go and knock the Kaiser off his throne, you see.
Everyone thought the war would be over at Christmas. And they really badly wanted to get to France to get in the fighting.
The Germans attacked first, and very quickly they were through Belgium and into France. The romantic notion of war that so many young men carried into battle was very quickly shattered. The new weapons of war were so ferocious that by the end of the first year, French casualties alone would approach 1 million men.
Nobody in Europe expected these appalling casualties. And when they came, they were utterly crushing. The first dreadful experience was that of the victims of what was called the Massacre of the Innocents in Germany. These boys from high school or college who were given a couple of months' training and sent off to the front, and who died in tens of thousands in a few weeks. Nothing like that had ever happened before to any country in Europe. And moreover, this was the flower of German youth. They were the best educated young men. They were from middle-class families almost exclusively. And they had no expectation at all that this terrible thing was going to happen.
Americans had never dreamed that a war on the other side of the ocean could affect them. The U.S. was officially neutral, and most of its citizens assumed it would stay that way.
People were going about their own business, object being to make money, good business. Everything was very pleasant indeed.
It's hard for people who weren't there then to realize how enormously the world has changed. On New Year's Day, President Wilson had open house at the White House. And you could go down, and we went down once. I was a little kid, I was taken along. Went down, and we stood in a little queue, and it moved up, and we all went through and shook his hand. Shook hands with the president on New Year's Day.
But certainly America was changing. The pace of life was quickening. Almost overnight, Henry Ford's historic assembly line had lowered the cost of making cars, as well as the cost of buying them. The mass-produced Model T came in one color, black. But at $295, it was the first car priced within reach of ordinary Americans.
We played baseball in the streets, and there was no problem playing baseball when horses and wagons dominated the traffic. It only became a problem when automobiles and trucks came in.
So much in America was changing as Europe went about its ugly war.
At this first movie that I attended, I recall the scene where there was a great deal of shooting. As they came to the front of the screen, and the figures got larger and larger, and I thought they were coming at me, and I started screaming so badly that they had to take me out of the movie house.
As movie-making techniques improved, movies became an American obsession, and it was in the movie houses that Americans were exposed to the war in Europe. In the movie house, it still seemed glamorous.
We went every Saturday morning and just devoured the pictures of the war. Beautiful uniforms and the dashing mounted cavalry with their flashing sabers in the sun riding into battle, and oh, I thought that would be something else. I was just aching to go.
The movies were the perfect proving ground for the new art form called propaganda. Americans saw and soon sympathized with the British view of the Germans. By early 1915, the war in Europe was good for America. U.S. banks were lending huge amounts of money to Britain and France, who in turn used the money to buy arms from American factories. With the war, Americans were in the greatest economic boom in their history.
During the war, everybody worked. Before the war, my father brought home $6 or $7 a week. Now he brought home checks for $100, $110 a week. It was like bringing home a check for $1 million.
The war had another effect. It virtually cut off European immigration to the United States, causing a labor shortage in American factories. And that forced northern employers to look for the very first time at the substantial black labor pool of the American South.
Black newspapers who went down south and told them, come on up to Chicago with us. We'll get you a job and take care of you. You don't have to stay down here and be lynched and burned.
My relatives, aunt, uncle, cousins, came north. We were able to get into factories and steel mills, jobs that just wouldn't have been available to blacks under normal circumstances.
This great migration from the South kept America's economy strong and vigorous, while the increasing economic stake in Britain and France encouraged greater support for their war against the Germans. But the war was not going well, and the idea that Americans might yet have to be involved was now an issue. All over the United States, with the support of former President Theodore Roosevelt, potential volunteers began to train for battle. By Christmas 1914, the armies of Europe had completely bogged down and fighting had spread to Russia, Africa, and the Middle East. The empires drew on their colonies for manpower. 60 countries were eventually represented in the conflict. The Germans had expected to win in 42 days, but they had not anticipated what would happen on the Western Front in France. On the Western Front, the German assault had finally failed, and soldiers on both sides had raced to dig an elaborate trench system that stretched for 300 miles from the English Channel all the way to Switzerland. On New Year's Day in 1915, the young men who had gone off to fight glorious battles were now trapped in a desperate war of attrition.
Someone said to us excitedly, "Jack Smith." I said, "What about him?" "He's dead, he's been shot. The first one of the battalion to be shot." I said, "What?" "Yes, he's dead, been shot. He put his head too far over and a sniper got him." And that caused a bit of a sensation amongst the lads. They thought, well, this is not exactly what we come for kind of business. But later on, from that day onwards, when we went to the trenches, it was 3 killed, 4 killed, 5 killed, 20 killed, 100 killed. By then, we was veterans.
A young American poet, Alan Seeger, was among those looking for adventure when he joined the Foreign Legion to fight for France. His diary reveals how seldom he found it.
It's a miserable life, shivering in these wretched holes in the dirt. We're not leading the life of men at all, but that of animals, living in our holes in the ground, and only showing our heads outside to fight and to feed.
When we'd been there about 6 months, covered in mud, wet through practically all day, absolutely chewed up my lice. We used to say, and to think we wanted to come to this hole. I said, yes, we didn't know.
Every so often, one side or the other seized a few hundred yards of territory only to be forced back again, surrendering what had cost hundreds of lives to win. The front never moved more than a mile or two in either direction. By the spring of 1915, the generals had concluded that the best way out of the stalemate was to blast the enemy out of their trenches. The same factories and assembly lines that had begun to contribute to life in the 20th century were now retooled to create massive killing machines. This was the industrialization of war.
There were just the splintered trunks of trees, and there was the quagmire of the shell holes, and no grass. It was just like a lunar landscape, really.
At night, the rats, they grew to enormous sizes, feeding on the corpses there. It was impossible to get the dead buried. We put dead bodies in the bottom of the trench so that we could stand on them to keep dry. And on some occasion, dead bodies was put on the top of the trench to make it higher, so that we could walk a bit better instead of crouching.
And contributing to the stalemate were new weapons. By now, the machine gun had been perfected to the point that a single soldier could command as much firepower as 40 riflemen. The tank made its first appearance, invented by the British to get through the dense thickets of barbed wire that protected the enemy trenches. And in April 1915, the Germans introduced the most terrifying weapon of all, poison gas.
No one had ever seen it before. This is the moment when chemical warfare was invented. It scared the living daylights out of the Canadian troops that were hit by it.
The First World War had become a contest not of fighting spirit, but of technological might. And for the soldiers caught in the middle of it, there was no way forward and no way back. There was simply endurance.
You saw a little bush, and you swore that bush was somebody creeping up on you. The perfect soldier then in that war would have been somebody with no imagination whatsoever. We all had too much imagination.
So many men who had been through these dangers and anxieties, their nerve broke and they were the victims of shell shock, you know. There is a breaking point for most people, for everybody really. Robbed of all humanity and courage and everything else that makes life worth living, really. He's descended to something less than human.
The stalemate in the trenches continued through 1915 and into 1916, when the generals decided to go back to their original weapon, their men. The River Somme, northern France, early summer 1916. Along a front 25 miles wide, a massive Allied army prepared to attack. Thousands of British Tommies, as they were called, would lead the charge, and they would follow one of the most intense bombardments in the history of warfare, an artillery barrage that would last an entire week. The Battle of the Somme was about to begin.
There must be 1,000 guns if there was one. It was a terrible roar from morning till night. But the foolish officers said, "Tomorrow, boys, you'll be over the top, and don't worry," he says. "There'll be no trenches there. Our shells have blown them to pieces. There'll be no Germans there. They're blown to pieces." All you have to do is to walk over and take those trenches. In fact, he says you can carry your rifle like a bag.
The Germans, after the shelling, they simply come out of the dugouts, grab their machine guns, and then waited for the Tommies. They just simply swathed them down, so you're cutting down grain. They didn't get 200 feet from the trench. One German machine gunner said, "I stopped firing because I was sickened by what we were doing."
It was the bloodiest day in British history. 20,000 men killed, 40,000 wounded. And yet, the day after, and for days after that, young men continued to be ordered out of their trenches and into near certain death.
Now, didn't that seem fun? Now, I don't know why any Americans would be opposed to go over into Europe and fight in those trenches. I really don't. But here's the vote. I fact-checked myself. Indeed, 82-6 was the vote in the Senate, and 373 to 50 was the vote in the House. So plenty voted no when Wilson asked for a declaration of war in 1917. But the large majority, they stood up and they cheered when Wilson, here he is, coming before the House of Representatives, all of Congress, to ask for a declaration of war, and he got it. The speech he gave that day is something to note. There's so much in here. I wish I had time, but the thing I wanted to just emphasize is that he's going on about how we stand for nothing but democracy and free trade and open relations between all nations. But the world must be made safe for democracy. Peace must be planted upon the tested foundations of political liberty. We have no selfish ends to serve. We desire no conquest, no dominion. We seek no indemnities for ourselves, no material compensation for the sacrifices we shall freely make. But we are one of the champions of the rights of mankind. I gotta say, I love that speech, and I believe in it, and I agree with it. And we could spend hours talking about whether Wilson really meant what he said, but we must make the world safe for democracy. So he gets his declaration of war. The United States is in. We immediately have to ramp up. Our army was 19th largest in the world at the time. So we quickly instituted a Selective Services Act. And so that was significant. This is the beginning of a draft. This is the beginning of every American at age 18 having to sign up to let Uncle Sam know that they turned 18 and are ready to go. We've had a selective service ever since. Still to this day, when you turn 18, boys only at this point, have to register with the Selective Service. So if indeed we ever have a draft in the future, they would have your name and number. So yeah, that's a federal law since 1917 that every American male has to sign up for that. And we went further. An interesting part of this war is how did the United States government change during war? And that's a great AP question that you could easily face, okay? We created an agency of the federal government known as the Committee on Public Information. If that doesn't sound creepy, it should sound creepy. I mean, that is obviously just sort of a propaganda arm of the United States, okay? But of course, the United States government had to sell people on the idea of war and had to raise money. So we had posters like this. Again, classic evil depictions of the German. We must beat back the Hun with Liberty Bonds. Liberty Bonds became a thing where people would loan the United States government cash. The government could use support the war effort, and you would get interest on your loan. So Liberty Bonds became a big deal. All right. We got to go further, though. We got to make sure that we don't have domestic opposition to this war. So in 1917, we also passed the Espionage Act. And the Espionage Act basically criminalizes any behavior that is supportive of an enemy during war. If you were to paste on Facebook today that you love ISIS, for example, that you love ISIS and you're a big believer in radical, violent, fundamentalist Islam, then it would be the Espionage Act that could get you into trouble, because we are currently at war with ISIS around the world. So the Espionage Act is alive and well as a piece of legislation. It has been, of course, limited by the federal court over the years. So, and we're going to talk about some of the great cases that come out of this, but not now, folks. Trying to wrap this up, but the ways in which this war changed the United States are endless. Okay, let's talk about African Americans. Okay, during World War I, as you saw in that video, there was the Great Migration, as it was called. 500,000 African Americans left the South and moved to northern cities. This created Harlem. Okay, when we did our next unit is on the 1920s, we have this vibrant, beautiful, amazing African American culture in New York City. Well, that didn't exist before World War I. There was just a trickle of African Americans in New York and in Chicago and Pennsylvania. But during the war, the Great Migration, because there were jobs and military industries in all these northern cities, Black people moved out of the South for the first time since the Civil War. And so we had this Great Migration. 2.3 million African Americans signed up to fight. So let's be clear, we had Black soldiers in the United States military since the Civil War, and they had mostly been relegated to the worst of jobs. Their numbers were limited. They never gained respect. They didn't get commissions, so we had no Black officers. And, you know, this is just a period of terrible discrimination against African Americans. And when this war started, Black people, Black Americans wanted to sign up just as all Americans did. And they wanted to particularly show that they were patriotic Americans at this point, or trying to gain acceptance in broader culture. So a huge number of Black Americans signed up to fight in this war. 375,000 fought, a much higher percentage than their white counterparts. And they began during this war to demand commissions. They demanded to be called officers. And it was Wilson was involved in saying no. And there was just a lot of debate about this during the war. And in the end, yes, African Americans did get that first step of being officers. So they're not just infantry. And so that's notable. Okay. And we had certain regiments who fought in France and in Europe, gaining great notoriety. Okay, the 92nd and 93rd U.S. Army Divisions, they fought in France against Germany. The French military and government gave them honors, gave them the equivalent of our Purple Heart. Well, when Black soldiers came home to America, no, the politics of our country were not going to give out honors to Black soldiers. So isn't that classic that they fought so well in Europe that the French soldiers that they fought along saw their bravery and courage and gave out awards. But at that point, it was politically not tenable to give Black soldiers awards in the United States military. But there's no question that Black soldiers served honorably in this war and gained some recognition. Mostly they were relegated to non-combat assignments. The thousands of miles of railroads that African American soldiers built within the United States during this war in order to help our supply distribution of weapons is notable, okay, because they weren't in all cases allowed to go fight in Europe. Women also were demanding to be able to be counted as citizens. They were ready to fight. Women signed up as, nurses and critical support and things like that. But this is the time when women started to say, give me a fucking gun. Okay. We're talking about women beginning their demand to be allowed to fight for their country. Okay. So the classic story is the men went off to fight in the war and the women took over in the industries. Okay. We tell that story and there's a lot of truth to that. Let's be clear. We had hundreds of thousands of women come out of the home and work in industry for the first time during this war. And that, involved its own progress. But let me just say that women were also asking to be soldiers. Women were also asking to be able to fight. And, but largely they were relegated to auxiliary units where they would be sort of nurses and critical support, but never allowed to actually wear the uniform. But their support was huge. We have, women revolutionizing nursing and medical care in this war. So a lot of progress yet to be made for women in the military at this point, but it does begin. Okay, so the U.S. joins the war. I don't even think I have a slide here, do I, on how this actual war ends? No. But before it ended, Wilson begins to talk about the future of the world after the war. And Wilson's contribution to global affairs, international relations, the new world order cannot be overstated, because as this war is fighting, Wilson begins to talk about how this can become the war to end all wars. And in 1918, the war is still fighting. He gave a speech, hugely important, his 14 points for peace. Wilson is a deeply complex character, and we'll be looking at all the other aspects of his presidency that are not so great, but let's recognize for this moment that Wilson was a great promoter of international law, an international world order, where nations were treated equally, where nations respected each other's sovereignty, where the oceans were free to trade by all nations. He even believed in disarmament. Wilson at this point was still talking about how countries should voluntarily accept limits on the size of their military. And all of these demands were wrapped up in what Wilson called his 14 points. And these were just declarations of what Wilson wanted to see in the world, but they are basically the foundation of what becomes the League of Nations, and then the United Nations, which still governs our world order today. Free trade, freedom to travel in the seas, reducing the size of armies, self-determination. He talked a big talk about how Europe should not be a Europe of empires. It shouldn't be, Russia and Germany up against each other. Where's Poland? Okay, so he publicly states this thing that we got to poll people, we got to give people the vote, and we got to let them decide what nation they want to be in. Okay? However, Wilson's massive blind spot is, of course, with non-white people. Okay? Wilson was a racist at home, and he was a racist even in his implementation of the New World Order. Okay? The idea, was that white people like the Polish and the Czechs and different white ethnic groups of Europe, yeah, they needed their own country. But when it came to the colonies in Asia and Africa, not so much. Okay, we did not see, him standing up for absolute end to imperialism, freedom for all colonies. He said that there should be better treatment in colonies. Okay, he said that white people should consider the interests of their African subjects, and so anyway, somewhat limited in that. But nevertheless, laying the foundations in his 14 points for the concepts that underlie the United Nations. Okay. The war ends essentially. Long story short, Germany ran out of supplies. Okay. This is a war of attrition. Germany fights against Britain and France on the Western Front for 4.5 years, and they just grind away, sending everything they had at each other. When the United States entered the war, we didn't really bring anything that wasn't already there, except more. We brought more weapons, more men, more supplies, and really, let's be clear, it was steel, rubber, petroleum that won this war. Britain cutting off Germany's access to its colonies, Germany's access to the world, slowly starved Germany of supplies that were needed to feed the war effort. Even with 12 million men dead, each side was still ready to send more young boys, or let's be clear, let's send younger boys and older men to go die in the trenches. It really wasn't men that was the limiting factor. It was rubber, steel, oil. Okay, and Germany slowly ran out. So in one big last-ditch effort, Germany attacked the Western Front and made a little bit of progress. In fact, they got quite close to Paris. This is right as the Americans are coming into the war, and Germany just basically runs out of everything. And so there they are, spread out all over France, having successfully advanced, but with no ability to bring up reinforcements. And so rather than, and this is the calculation of Germany, rather than accept the Allied forces are going to push them back and take defeat after defeat after defeat and continue to be defeated to Berlin, they made the smart move to, when extended almost just outside of Paris, to say, hey, we surrender. Because they knew they were done with their bullets, okay? And so Germany just does an unconditional surrender on November 11th, 1918. This is what we celebrate as Veterans Day to this day. And the war finally ended. Yeah, so the guns were quieted, okay? So we just see a devastating toll. United States got in late, and as soon as we got in is right when Germany was doing its sort of last sort of final assault. So Americans just got chewed up as fast as any other, combatants in this war. A lot of Americans like the story that, we stayed out, and they're fighting and fighting. We stayed out of the war, we stayed out of the war. And in 1917, we joined the war, and then in 1918, the other side surrendered. So didn't we win this war? The United States contributed to the victory in this war by contributing its weapons, and we've been contributing those weapons since 1914. What won this war was just bigger factories and more supplies and more weapons and more people, and getting more people into this battle, because nobody had any special tricks. There was no strategic victory here. Nobody had a better weapon. Nobody had a better strategy. This was just the grinding away of what they had, which was cannons and people and machine guns, and just grinding until one side says we give. So it's a sad ending to the Great War, is what they called it when it started. But the end of this war, the treaty that ended it, is more important than the war itself, because here we have all of the great powers of the world coming together, all very aware that they had just experienced the worst war in human history. Wilson out there giving this grand rhetoric, this is the war to end all wars. And people felt that. Every country involved was sickened by this war. And the general feeling in 1918 was, oh God, we can never do this again. Oh God, the new weapons of industrial war are so terrible that no one would ever think to fight a war again, now that we understand what war means in the modern world. And there they were, sitting at a table with people thinking, all right, what can we do to make a treaty that ends this war that will prevent future wars? And that's certainly what Wilson was thinking, to his credit. He went to Europe. Wilson spent some 7 months in Europe negotiating the peace at the end of this war. Can you imagine the US president spending 7 months out of the country now? It's just incredible. So he tirelessly went to Europe, and he browbeat the presidents of France and Italy and Britain, who were these are the winners. They called it the Big Four, who represented the Allies at the end of the war, although there were some 65 countries that had joined on the Ally side. But when Austria-Hungary and Germany finally surrendered, they had to accept the terms of their defeat. And so this is the Treaty of Versailles. Okay, the Treaty of Versailles was written in the Great Palace of Versailles in France, and this treaty came up with the terms for peace. And there's Wilson saying, we need to get at the fundamental root causes of this war. You get it? We need to solve militarism, nationalism, imperialism. So he had these grand ideas about nations accepting the borders of other nations and reducing militaries and all this. Well, unfortunately, Britain and France had a little bit more, bitterness. Okay, let's be clear. It was their countries that were utterly devastated by this war. Okay, and so Britain and France came into this peace conference wanting to punish Germany. And this is the classic story. And I'm going to end here that you have, Wilson hoping to lay the foundations for a permanent peace. Not fully true, because he still had blind spots, but Europeans really wanting to punish Germany and say, no, the way to end wars is to make it so that countries like Germany that start wars like this get smacked down and never do it again. And so we get a combination. Okay, mostly Britain, France, and Italy got their way. Anger ruled the day. Okay, we have a permanent reduction of the German military. We have a reduction. Germany can't build any weapons. Germany has to take total guilt, accept guilt for the war. This was just a slap in their face, okay? Every country was imperialistic. Every country was nationalistic. But in the end, Germany had to say it was all our fault. They had to pay significant scratch. Germany was required to pay Britain, France, and Belgium for the damage that they caused in this war. And they had to pay 31 billion. And this is not like today adjusted. That's what it was then. So you can imagine, this is hundreds of billions today. $1 billion a year to Britain and France. Basically, it was about how much Britain and France owed to the U.S. banks for all the money they borrowed during the war. And so conveniently, the British were like, all right, Germany, you got to give us 31 billion. And so that money was coming for us. Anyway, we'll talk about that more. But look, they take a piece of Germany for coal. Yes, now here's Wilson's side coming in. Okay, we created some new countries. Okay, self-determination. This is a positive. So you got a Europe of empires before. We get a few more countries created, a few more borders basically based on ethnic nationalities that live there. Poland, hey, thank you, Poland. You get to be a country now. You know, Czech Republic, Czechoslovakia. Okay, they messed it up. We now know it should have been Czech Republic and Slovakia. But a lot of the borders of the world were drawn after World War I. Okay, let's be clear. The Treaty of Versailles drew these borders. Okay, I think, let me see, I have another one. Yeah, the borders of the Middle East. Okay, remember the Ottoman Empire, which was Turkey, and this whole area was ruled by an empire that sided with Germany. Big mistake, all right? And then they went crashing down, and so Britain, the United States, and France were able to come into the Ottoman Empire and redraw the borders. So the borders of Iraq and Jordan and Palestine, which becomes Israel, were drawn after this war. So yeah, lots of world borders drawn, okay? Germany loses all its colonies, but Britain and France don't agree to give up their colonies. So that's one of those ways in which this treaty could have actually laid the foundations for future peace in the world. You know, how about a principle? No colonies. Not quite. We're not there yet, okay? But the big crown jewel in the Treaty of Versailles was Woodrow Wilson's idea of a League of Nations. And this was his idea. It was, you know, his baby, and he was successful in getting it implemented. Okay, he fought for it, and he got the countries to agree to it, and we created it. And it was a good idea. The League of Nations, this place where countries can have dialogue and debate and make rules that are fair and equal for all countries around the world. And they set it up. Bunch of countries signed on, not just European countries. And, you know, you got to say that this was a positive thing. Now, sadly, with regard to the Treaty of Versailles, the U.S. never joined it. Wilson signed this treaty. He wrote parts of it, and he was totally bought in. But when he brought it home, Wilson was a Democrat. Republicans controlled Congress. They were not going to ratify his treaty. And so, sadly, this treaty goes into the trash bin. So we don't join the League of Nations. The League kicked Germany out, said they couldn't join, kicked Russia out because they had become communists. So 3 great world powers, US, Germany, and Russia, are all excluded from this new League of Nations, which, you know, when the ugliness of World War II rears its head, the League was ineffectual and unable to create world peace or to maintain peace because, well, in part because these world powers were excluded from it and weren't at the table. The whole purpose is to bring combatants to the table. But that's a story for another day, you guys. So, you know, I have this graphic, which is the German depiction of what happened, which is that they had to reduce their military and everything, but every other country got to agree to keep building weapons. And let's just end there that, you know, Wilson did talk about all countries universally reducing their militaries. And he made the proposal that how about none of us put bombs on planes? How about none of us arm planes? Because the plane was not a big part of World War I. Planes couldn't carry very much weight at that point, so they couldn't unload lots of bombs. Can you imagine if we had just agreed internationally that no one would have weaponized planes? Some 40 million people died in World War II because of bombings from planes. So Unfortunately, the way the treaty was written, Germany couldn't build an air force, but everybody else could. But anyway, this is the story. I'm going to end it here. It's getting dark in here. Got a lot of great video resources for you to go and check out. I mean, there's no end to how much you can nerd out on World War I history. I for sure love it. Go watch the movie called, well, there's 1917 that just came out, but I'd even recommend the old classic Gallipoli as a World War I movie. Yeah, about Australians fighting in World War I. But thanks for listening. Peace out.